Good evening. It's so good to see all of you tonight. Happy to have another opportunity to study with you in the book of Matthew. We were studying last week about the burial of Christ, and we're going to look at the guards being stationed at the tomb, and in the beginning of chapter 28, of course, there's the resurrection of Christ from the dead. Before we enter into our study, we want to begin with the word of prayer, help prepare our minds to study and to go to our Heavenly Father. We ask Brother Brody to direct our minds.
That you give us. In His name we pray.
Amen. All right, so last time after we got through going through the record about Jesus' burial, we see the Pharisees and the scribes and the chief priest going to Pilate to try to secure the body, to make sure that no one would disturb the body of Christ. They remember him making prophecies and statements about being raised from the dead on the third day. Now, on the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate. So the day of preparation was Friday. The day before a Sabbath day, when you got everything together for that day of rest, and made sure, I guess, that you had whatever food you needed left over for the next day and all kinds of other things, because there's no work or cooking or anything on the Sabbath day. So Friday was the preparation day. That's the day that Jesus died, was on Friday, and was buried. And of course, once the Sabbath started, there could be no more tending to Jesus' body. He'd been buried by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. The women had carefully observed where Jesus was laid, and then they were going to come back as soon as the Sabbath was over and finish embalming his body and preparing it with further spices and sweet-smelling savors that they could put upon the body. It says, saying, "Sir, we remember that deceiver said while he was yet alive, 'After 3 days I rise again.'" So you see that the Pharisees and scribes, they took note of the predictions that Jesus had made. And it's something that the disciples, because of their great shattered hopes about Jesus being this king that they'd been waiting on, and now he's been put to death, even though he'd made all these predictions very plainly to the disciples, they just go out of their minds, it seems like, altogether. But the enemies are always looking for how, their position might be disturbed by Jesus and his influence. And they're afraid that if they don't do something to secure the body of Christ, his disciples might come and steal his body away, and they'll have more trouble with them teaching he's a resurrected Christ than they would while he was alive. So they're very concerned and go to Pilate to try to make sure there's not going to be any further disturbance about this. And of course, they actually help all of us as Christians by making sure a guard gets stationed, and they put a seal on the tomb so that there's no question the body was in the tomb and it was all sealed up and it was guarded and nobody could steal it. And yet he was raised. The tomb's empty on the first day of the week. So it just adds more power to the gospel that these enemies do these things, even though that wasn't their purpose. Some of the things that Jesus had said that the scribes and Pharisees has heard, you remember Jesus told them he wasn't going to give them any other sign except the sign of Jonah. Jonah was eaten by that great fish, and then he was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, and then was vomited out and went and preached to the city of Nineveh. So that miracle that took place foreshadowed what Christ would be. He would be 3 days in the earth, and then he would be raised from the dead, like Jonah had come back out of that fish. And he also said on another occasion, when he came to the temple at the beginning of his ministry in the Gospel of John, they were asking for what sign he was going to give them for doing the things he did, like cleansing the temple. And he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." He was talking about his body. And so they remember that prophecy that he'd mentioned 3 days. And he said that he was going to lay down his life and by the authority of God, and he had authority to take it up again when he preached the sermon on, the good shepherd and the sheep. He had mentioned the resurrection in that sermon, and that was one everybody heard. So they had heard him say about 3 days he was going to be raised, and they took it to heart. And even though the disciples are explicitly told the details about what was going to happen, him being turned over to the Romans and being put to death, and on the third day rising again, that we've studied earlier in the book of Matthew 3 different times, he mentioned there the resurrection. But they're still puzzled about it. We were told in the book of Mark that they thought he was talking figuratively somewhere. They just couldn't reconcile him dying and then being the king, and how that could be. He must be talking about something spiritual or something instead of a literal death and resurrection. They wanted to believe he's never going to die, so he would never need to be resurrected from the dead. So you see the different psychological attitude that the disciples have versus what the chief priests and scribes, the way they look at it all. The enemies are dreading his influence, and the others have their hopes dashed, and their ideas about a materialistic kingdom are blocking their minds from understanding what Christ said. Verse 64, therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people, he has risen from the dead. And the last deception will be worse than the first. So they implore of Pilate, we need a guard. We need some Roman soldiers to guard this tomb. He says that they don't want this impostor's influence to go beyond his death, and says until the third day. Do you see the way they understood Jesus when he said that he would be, on the third day he'd be raised from the dead? Here that even the chief priests understand that means until the third day. So he's buried on Friday, part of the day. He's in the tomb on Saturday. And then early on the first day of the week is when he's going to be raised from the dead. So it's really just part of 2 days and 1 day. But that's the same way they used the language. They understood the same thing. We need to guard it until the third day. And then that'll cover his prophecy that he made. So they wanted to make sure they have a Roman guard to watch over the tomb and make sure that he's not raised. So I guess they would be there till Monday started, and then the prophecy would have been proven wrong. He's not going to rise from the dead. And notice how people, this is a sad thing about human nature, that people that are dishonest and underhanded, they tend to think everybody else is like them. That's the way they think. They would use underhanded tactics to get Jesus condemned, and they had that kangaroo court to get him crucified. And so they think, well, the disciples would stoop to anything to make this deceiver look good. So they would steal the body and make up these lies. Well, that's not the kind of character that Jesus had or his disciples had, to be liars and deceivers. They taught and understood the very opposite of that, the way you're supposed to live and the way you're supposed to act. But evildoers or ill-deemers, one commentator said, or dishonest people think everybody else is like them. And the disciples, again, seem to be unable to think about a resurrection from the dead. They all think he's dead and it's over, and the women are thinking of embalming his body. They're not thinking about him being raised from the dead. That's just being temporary. And the male disciples don't seem to be thinking any differently about it. But these scribes and chief priests and all, they are thinking that. He was talking about a literal resurrection from the dead. Pilate said to them, you have a guard. Go make it as secure as you know how. So Pilate agrees to go along with their request. He gives them a guard. So you got some Roman soldiers that are appointed to be under the authority of the chief priest to make sure this tomb is taken care of and nobody will be able to break into it. The body won't be able to be stolen out of the tomb. And so he grants what they requested. They requested, we need a guard. And it wasn't Jewish guards. The Jewish temple guards only had authority at the temple. That's the only place. They weren't like the Roman soldiers that could be, just deployed anywhere they wanted. They had to go to Pilate to get these Roman soldiers to be in charge outside the city. And of course, they'd be able to be there on the Sabbath day. They wouldn't care if it was a Sabbath day or not. The Roman soldiers would be on guard. And it wasn't a problem for them to be working on that day. So these are Roman soldiers is what we should picture in our minds. And they're stationed there. And later on, you can see they're under the control of the Jewish priest, because they go and report to them when Jesus' body, the angel descends and rolls the stone away, and they run away. They go to the chief priest and tell them what happened. And of course, they're going to pay him a large sum of money to say the disciples came and stole his body. Is going to be the lie that they're paid to tell. But again, by making secure this tomb, they're actually authenticating the resurrection. There'd always be some question, well, maybe somebody did take his body. But if you've got a Roman guard standing there, and we know how, studying on our class on Sunday, about if you, let anything happen to something under your charge, you get punished for it, maybe even put to death. That's what Herod did to the ones that were guarding Peter. When Peter got away, when the angel let him loose, all the soldiers were put to death. So these Roman soldiers aren't going to let somebody come steal the body. That's not going to happen. They're going to guard it carefully. And then we look at some of the provisions that were made, and they went and made the grave secure. Along with the guard, they set a seal on the stone. If you picture that great stone, the women, were wondering, who's going to move that stone for us? It was so large. So it was a large stone rolled against the door, but that wasn't just that. They also put some rope or cord across it and waxed it on either side and stamped it with a Roman seal to show nobody's to disturb this area. It's like we have crime tape or something put up, and police barrier or something. Nobody's supposed to go past that barrier under the authority of the Roman government would come after you if you violated the seal on that tomb. So it just shows that they, as far as human power was concerned and Roman authority, they weren't going to let anybody mess with that tomb until the 3 days were up. And they're going to threaten anybody that would try to do anything about it. But, of course, the angels God doesn't care about their seal, does he? God doesn't care what men do or what provisions they make. He's the Almighty. He rules over everything. He sends an angel down, and that angel doesn't care a bit about that seal. And opening up that tomb for everybody to see, Jesus is gone. He has been raised from the dead. And there's nothing these guards or anybody else can do to stop it. So it's all precautions that are futile that they put up. It mentions in Psalms 2, a messianic psalm that talks about all of the enemies trying to keep God's anointed, the Christ, from becoming king. That's what Psalms 2 starts off talking about. And God is in heaven, and he's laughing at them. They think they can stop Jesus Christ from coming to the throne and ruling at God's right hand. And of course, the Apostle Peter brings that up with the other apostles after the apostles had been arrested and ordered not to preach anymore. They quoted that passage in Acts chapter 4, that Herod and Pilate were those rulers of the nations along with the Jewish people that tried to fight against Christ, but he rose from the dead anyway, and he's king anyway. And here's going to be another example of all of that happening. So Psalms 2:4 says, "He who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord scoffs at them." Psalm 74:10, "For the wrath of man shall praise you. With a remnant of wrath you will gird yourself." So God looks at the wrath of men and the power of men, and he just laughs. He takes the power of Pharaoh trying to keep the people from leaving Egypt. He just used Pharaoh to glorify himself with those 10 plagues in Egypt, right? Some king tries to stand up to him, it just makes God look better. So it doesn't matter which way you go, God gets glorified, either by his judgment or by you doing what's right. He'll get glorified. So he's going to be glorified no matter what kind of things they try to do to stop him. It's just going to make it look bigger when Christ rises from the dead. And anybody else have a thought on these verses, these preparations? A lot of great information about that tomb. All right, well, that brings us then to chapter 28. Jesus arose, of course, is what this chapter is going to tell us. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell about the things that happened on that day. They all describe the scene from their own individual points of view and emphasize different things about what happened on that morning and different appearances that he made to different people. Matthew's going to have a unique account about the appearance to the women that go to the tomb. John's Gospel tells about the appearance to Mary Magdalene that happened. And Luke's Gospel will tell us about him appearing to the two on the road, that were going, and then appearing to all the disciples that night. And so does John tell about that night. So does Mark. But the story about the women and him appearing to them is just sort of, referred to in the other Gospels. But here you get the details of what happened. So their tomb is visited by the women. The stone is rolled away by the angel. The angel shows them that Jesus has been raised. Tells them to go in and look at the place where he was laid. And then, as they're running from the tomb to go tell the apostles and the disciples about the tomb being empty and Christ being raised, Jesus himself appears to those women and gives them further encouragement and message for the disciples to receive. And then there's a report of the soldiers that flee the tomb to the Jewish authorities and how they try to bribe them from telling what happened. And there's the appearance then to the 11 and to others in Galilee. That is at the end of the chapter. So that's what parts of the resurrection story Matthew's going to tell us. It says, now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn towards the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. So in Matthew's account, again, each of them are, tell their part about who the women were. And Matthew just kind of summarizes with a couple of names, but we know there were several other women that were there also that went and got spices and came to the tomb. So it was a whole group of women besides just these two that are mentioned here. And we know Mary Magdalene didn't stick around. And yet there's a plurality of women that the angel talks to. So you have to put all the accounts together to get the full picture of what happened that morning. It says after the Sabbath. Do we remember when the Sabbath begins? You're talking Jewish time?
Sundown.
Sundown on Saturday.
Oh, Saturday.
Yeah. Now, all day Saturday, from Friday night until Saturday night is the Sabbath. So they go night and then the day. And here, so after the Sabbath, it says on Saturday night, when the sun goes down, the women could go buy spices. They can do whatever. You're not under the Sabbath rules anymore. And then early, as it's about to dawn on the daytime part of the first day of the week, first day of the week started when the sun went down on Saturday night. And then early, before the sun comes up, is when they're coming to the tomb. They've got their spices and things. So after the Sabbath, after that time was over and they could move around and come to embalm the body and all of that can happen, the women come to the tomb. And of course, there's different ways in which this is described. The sun had risen when they got to the tomb. They started off. They came to the tomb and it was still dark. What gospel says? Well, if you're in town and the tomb is outside of town, and you take off to go early in the morning before the sun comes up, it's just an instant, isn't it, between you're in the dark, and then by the time you actually get to the tomb, the sun is coming up. That's what happened. So people that are trying to find contradictions in the Gospels, that's the kind of things they'll go to, is things like that. Well, one of them says it was dark. One of them said the sun was up. Well, when they started off, it was dark. By the time they got there, it was light. And that is clearly what is being described in Matthew 16:1. When the Sabbath was over, is what Mark says, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might come and anoint him. So here we got Salome, which is the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So that's James and John's mother, is Jesus' aunt. It is Salome. And you got Mary Magdalene, that disciple that's been following him and supporting him. And Mary, the mother of James. And Joseph, she's Clopas' wife. Maybe the sister-in-law of Mary, is what some early Christians say about her. So they didn't know anything about, evidently, that the Jews went and got the soldiers. That was all on the Sabbath day. So they weren't moving around or going to the tomb. They don't know there's supposed to be soldiers there and it's supposed to be, guarded and all. They're just going to bring their spices. They have no idea about that. And when they get there, they're going to find the tomb's already open. They don't have to worry about, the soldiers, because they're terrified and leave when they see the angel. So no mention of the seal or anything in their discussions on the way to the tomb. They just come to, finish anointing the body. Start in the dark and arrive during the light is the way to harmonize these Gospels. And the word came it means both come and go, that word in the Greek. And, some translators don't care anything about harmonizing the Gospels. So they'll use came every place or go, but whichever one makes the story right. You either translate it, they were going to the tomb when it was dark, and they came to the tomb when it was light. The word means both. So keep that in mind when you think about these passages. In Mark's gospel, it says, very early on the first day of the week, they came to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? Looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, although it was extremely large. So it is rolled away, and you get the idea it was not just over to the side like most of the pictures show, but completely out of the track and laying on the ground. This great stone, that angel just moved that thing out of the way completely. In Luke's gospel, it says, but on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. And in Luke 24 and verse 10, we read about some other women that were there. So we got two mentioned in Matthew, and then there's three of them mentioned in Mark, and now Luke mentions some other women. So, there was a number of women that were there. And some of them we know their names, and some of them we don't. In Luke 24:10, it says, now they were Mary Magdalene and Joanna. She wasn't mentioned in the other two Gospels. And Mary, the mother of James, also the other women. Well, who are the other women? There's some more women, see? So there's a whole group of them that are going to witness all of this and go back and tell people. So, and the other women with them were telling these things to the apostles. And then in John's gospel, in John chapter 20 and verse 1, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb while it was still dark. So when they started off, it was dark. And it was very early when they get close enough to see the stone rolled away. Now the sun's coming up. But on the way, it was dark. And when they see it, and Mary Magdalene sees that stone rolled away, what would be your assumption if you weren't thinking about a resurrection? What do you think they were thinking? Somebody has messed with the tomb, right? Somebody has desecrated the tomb. And so she just turns on her heels right there and takes off. So Mary Magdalene there's all these other women go on to the tomb. But Mary took off to get Peter and John. So there's a separation between the two groups. And we're going to find out here in Matthew's gospel, he appears to the women. Jesus does. But the other gospels say he first appeared to Mary Magdalene. You think, well, how did that happen? She was with him. No, she wasn't. John's gospel tells us she took off. So they were separated from each other. So it's only when you get all four accounts that it makes sense. One of them left to go get Peter and John and say, hey, somebody has messed with the tomb. The stone is gone. Verse 2, and behold, a severe earthquake had occurred. For an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. So just like there was at the moment that Jesus died, there was an earthquake. Here there's an earthquake at the moment that this angel descends to roll the stone away so everybody can see Jesus has been raised. It doesn't appear Jesus needed the stone rolled away to be resurrected. You remember what he does on the first day of the week? Where were the apostles when he appears to them? And how'd that happen? You remember? They were in a locked room, and he just appeared in the room. So you think he could have got out of the tomb the same? He didn't need the stone rolled away. He could, and the next week when he appeared to Thomas was there too. He also just appeared in the room. So they didn't have to roll the stone away for him to get out. But you did have to have the stone rolled away so the women could get in. And the apostles could get in. They could come and see the evidence that his body wasn't there anymore. So the angel comes down and there's this earthquake and this being, this angel, just like every other case in the Bible, when an angel appears, a messenger from God, it terrifies people to where they feel like they're going to die. They're so afraid. You know, we just imagine we see a ghost or something. It makes us afraid, maybe. But what if you actually saw an angel come down whose face was like lightning and he's glowing, like glowing metal or whatever, and appears to you and starts talking to you? I mean, that everybody, loses it when they see an angel. And that's the way these soldiers are. Can you imagine? They may have heard a lot of rumors about, there was an earthquake the moment he died. And all the other soldiers that were guarding the crucifixion, they said, he is surely the Son of God. And there's all kinds of terrifying things happened that day. Don't you think that rumor got around to the other soldiers? This is probably a different group of soldiers guarding the tomb. But they probably heard some things. And now, at this moment, an earthquake happens too, right? When the resurrection's being revealed here. And so the angel removes the stone right before the women arrive. They are early in the morning, and reveals the empty tomb for them to see. And all the witnesses can come in. And again, the resurrection, the exact moment, there weren't any witness given about how it happened. I don't know. His life came back into his body, and whether he just came out of those wrappings and they just collapsed there where he was laying. I don't know if that's how it was. Or he got up and unwrapped them and then laid them there. We know he did wrap up the face covering and fold it up. We have details about that. But exactly how the resurrection happened exactly, we're never told that. We're just told about the appearances that he makes after he's raised from the dead. But the actual moment of the resurrection isn't talked about. Just that it had to happen, right? It's one of those necessary inferences. He couldn't be out appearing to people if he hadn't to come back to life. So the stone is moved, and it seems to be just moved completely out of its place. One artist there does show that stone just flying away. I think that's the right picture about what happened. That angel just flips that thing out of the way, and then he comes down and sits on it. And he's glowing, looking at these soldiers. How would you feel if you were one of those soldiers? Well, that's described in verse 3. And his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow. So this angel appears, this blinding flash of light there in the early morning before dawn. This angel descends out of heaven. And again, if you were already kind of anxious. Now you've made it through a whole night and nothing happened while you're guarding this tomb, and then all of a sudden, boom, here comes this light, and this person clothed in light comes down out of heaven. They were terrified, and his face is, we've all had lightning somewhere close by, how bright that is. Think about somebody's face being that bright with heavenly glory shining out of their face. And then you look at their clothes, and their clothes are whiter than any white you've ever seen. That's always the way it's described, isn't it? When the same kind of language is used to talk about angels in the Old Testament, it's like they're glowing metal, and there's just this shining, like you see metal that's melted, and glowing in a furnace, that kind of light. And that's what Daniel saw with the angel that appeared to him, and their eyes looked like fire. Jesus looked the same way. When the transfiguration is described, when Christ is glorified on the mountain, his face is brighter than the sun. So that'd be like lightning, wouldn't it? They say lightning's even hotter than the sun. And then his clothes are whiter than any launderer can whiten his clothes, is what one of the Gospels says. So this angel's clothed like that too. His clothes are white like, blinding snow. You have to put, your sunglasses on. You're up in that snow skiing and stuff, or you'll go snow blind. It's so bright. That's the way his clothes look. It's shining. That's the only earthly thing they can compare it to describe it to us. And Christ is described that way when he appeared to John on the Isle of Patmos. He was, a glorified body that he appeared in then. So we know that when you're connected to the presence of God, people take on a glow, don't they? Maybe that's what's reflected in the angels, that they glow like God does. God dwells in inapproachable light, is what Paul says. Well, what about all those beings around him? They're also light. They reflect that light at least. When Moses was in the presence of God on Mount Sinai, when he came down, what did his face look like? His face was glowing. Everybody was afraid to come close to him because just being in God's presence made his skin glow. Well, these angels really are in God's presence, and they come down. They're associated with light. And when he appears to the shepherds, remember the angel comes down and the heavenly host, and they're talking to the shepherds. It says the glory was all around the shepherds too. It lit up the whole area when that angel was giving them the good news that a Savior had been born. And so a lot of pictures of this heavenly light in these beings. And we're told that the saints have this kind of clothing on that's brighter than snow and whiter than any whites you can think of. The 24 elders that are sitting around the throne in Revelation 4, they're clothed in these same kind of white robes. And they represent the church. Those that have gone on to heaven. And what does he say he's going to do to those that were beheaded for the cause of Christ and their souls are under the altar in chapter 6? It says he gave them a white robe and told them to wait for a little while longer until the number of their brethren, that are going to die is complete. And so that's something it's a picture. I don't know how, what kind of clothing a spirit would put on in paradise or in the presence of God, but that's the picture that's given, is they have a white robe like these angels that they're wearing, all of the saints that have left this world. And that picture is given over and over. And of course, pictures of God are him dwelling in this kind of light too. Any other thoughts on verse 3? We don't know a lot about the spiritual realm, so anything we get on it is a big deal, isn't it? About what are our loved ones like that have died in the faith? They're somewhere glorious. That's where they're at. And that's what's pictured there. This being that comes down out of heaven to give a message from God. And the angels, did I skip a page of my notes here? Let's see. I skipped verse 4. I must have put my notes on verse 5 right over the top of my notes on 4. So anyway, I hope I can recover those at home somehow. I have to look at verse 4 and just have to remember what I wrote down there. But it's talking about these soldiers and their reaction to these things, and it's quite dramatic description that is given of how they reacted when they saw this angel with a face like lightning and all of this power. And he came with an earthquake. An earthquake, what can you do about an earthquake? Nothing, right? That's something that you can't make it happen, and you can't keep it from happening. It's something, as a human being, you have no control over whatsoever. And it is a scary thing when every earthquake I've ever felt is such a scary, weird thing that the world is shaking and you don't know when it's going to stop and how much worse it's going to get. And there's nothing anybody in the whole world can do about it until it decides to stop. And I just think about how they felt just that and then seeing what they saw at the same time. Put those two together. 28:4, it says, "And the guards shook for fear of him and became like dead men." So, I don't know, have any of you been as scared that you're shaking? I can remember being scared like that. Sometimes I get that way at different times where I'm in some situation teaching God's word to somebody, and like I know that this situation, their life is on the line, and I'm so responsible for what's going on that I shake. But this is shaken from fear, that you see this messenger and you're just, not only is the ground shaking, they're shaking. On the inside, they're shaking. And yet they are like dead men. What is a dead man? I don't know if you can picture that in your mind. If you're just a dead man, a dead man can't move. He can't go anywhere. He's immobile. And maybe he's a waxen color, like a dead corpse when he's so scared. All the blood runs out of your face. We've heard of that, right? So they're standing there in front of this angel. They can't run. They can't hide. All they can do is stand there with their mouth open, in fear when this angel comes down. So there's not any thinking about fighting him or anything else. And it doesn't tell us when they took off. So I don't know when they took. And that's a kind of a mystery. We know they run to the chief priests. So at some point they leave. And we know the women are showing up pretty quick after this. And there's no mention of the women seeing them. So I guess this momentary immobility, finally, they got enough control that they took off and ran away. But I don't know how long it was. Either that or you'd have to picture the women come up and the angel talks to them in the next verse. And the guys are still standing there out of their wits, don't know what to do. But my thought was they ran off eventually, just took off. And so the women get there, there's no guards. Just the stone's gone. And then they talk to this angel that's there. Anybody else have a thought on any of that?
So the women didn't actually see that happen. It's like the way it explains it in Matthew, it seems like they were there, like they were there when it happened.
The picture I get is they're on their way and they see the stone rolled away, and then Matthew tells you how the stone got rolled away. So that happened before they got there. They didn't, Mary Magdalene's with them and she sees it from a distance, the stone's gone and took off. So they didn't actually see the angel come down and do that, but Matthew explains what actually happened. He's the one that tells us. We're not told about that in other places, but Matthew tells us, here's what happened. The angel came down, there was an earthquake, and he threw the stone out of the way, and they took off. So, no guards, nobody to stop them from going in the tomb. And then in verse 5, it says, "The angel said to the women, Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. So they get there, they go on up to the tomb to examine things, and there's an angel there. Now, did the angel talk to him outside, and then he takes them inside? Was he inside, and they went inside, and then he starts talking to them? And the other Gospels mention there's two of them. One is sitting at the head, and one is at the feet at one point. When Mary Magdalene finally runs back to the tomb, and Peter and John had already left again, so everybody's running all over the place when you think about this morning. And she gets there, and they've left, and she's crying, and she looks inside and sees two young men sitting inside the tomb, these two angels. And they say, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She says, "They've taken away the Lord's body." And then she turned around, and Jesus was standing behind her. So these angels, only one is mentioned in Matthew. But that's not unusual when you're talking about some event. That there might be two. I always think about two policemen maybe when you get pulled over for something or something happens, and one of them's in charge, and one of them's doing the talking. And when you tell the story, you might not even mention the other guy. If two or three of you are in the car, we're saying this officer came up and he said, and so forth and so on, and the other guy's standing there, but he's not really the active one. And somebody else will say, "Oh yeah, there were these two cops," and they came up and the guy said, So that's the way the Gospels are. Matthew just tells the summary of what the one that was talking did. When you're reading in Luke and John, there's two of them. So, again, if you're looking for a contradiction to not believe and tear the Bible down, and there's things like that. But in a court of law, when you got a bunch of witnesses to something, and they're not telling the story exactly the same, but all their details harmonized, that is powerful. It's when they all say exactly the same thing you think they all colluded together and made up the story. And obviously they didn't all get together and decide what to write in each of these Gospels. They just wrote it independently. And the essential facts are the same. The tomb was empty, an angel was there, and there was a message from heaven about what they were to do that came to them that night, or that morning. So, again, you have the women, and you got Mary, the mother of James, and Joseph, and others, including Joanna. And you're assuming the same women that are mentioned over in chapter 16 of Mark that went and bought the spices on Saturday night after the Sabbath ended. It included Salome there. And the last service they can do for him after he has died, but he's not dead anymore. They don't know that. They're coming, we're going to do our last thing. And they'll never serve Jesus that way again, will they? Because he's been raised from the dead. They're not even going to be able to complete what they started here, because he is alive. And they're going to find out he doesn't need that kind of service anymore. He lives. He is alive. So the angel tells them, don't be terrified. They have the same reaction every other human being has. They're scared when they see this angel. But he tells them, stop being afraid. Is literally what it says. Don't go on being afraid, because I've got good news for you. You've come looking for Jesus' body, and his body is not here. He has risen. That'd be a reason not to be afraid if the Lord has been risen. Well, we'll have to come back and take up with verse 5 next time. I see the other classes out.